Hello and welcome to the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. My name is Claudia Rizzini. I am the Executive Director of the Fellowship Program. The Radcliffe Institute brings together students, scholars, and practitioners from across disciplines and the professions to create and share transformative ideas. You can participate in this laboratory of ideas by attending public programs such as this one, visiting virtual exhibitions, or pursuing the special collection held at the Schlesinger Library. To learn more about Radcliffe, please feel free to sign up to receive information on news and events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. We'll begin the program with a presentation by Professor Rajiv Sethi. After the presentation, the speaker will respond to questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any time throughout the program. We ask that you keep your questions brief to allow to address as many as possible in the time that we have together. And now it is my pleasure to introduce this year's Choi Foundation Fellow, Rajiv Sethi. He is a professor of economics at Barnard College, Columbia University, and an external professor at Santa Fe Institute. Professor Sethi is an applied theorist employing insights from economics and other fields to address some of the most painful and pervasive problems in U.S. public policy. Professor Sethi recently co-authored Shadow of Doubt: Stereotypes, Crime, and the Pursuit of Justice. In this work, the authors bring perspectives from many disciplines into their analysis of crime, policing, and the justice system. Specifically, they explore how stereotypes can influence the way in which crimes are perpetrated, prosecuted, and judged, revealing that stereotypes play a much more insidious and pervasive role than previously imagined. At Radcliffe, Rajiv will pursue the subject further by looking at the geographical variability of police violence in the United States. The use of deadly force by law enforcement officers in the United States is extremely high by international standards and involves significant racial disparities. In particular, the frequency of fatal encounters between citizen and police officers vary widely across geographic areas of the country. The main goal of the project is to understand why such large variations exist across states, cities, and law enforcement agencies, and to propose effective policy remedies. Professor Sethi is part of a small group of faculty spearheading CORE USA, an organization dedicated to the reform of economics education and the enrichment of economic discourse in the United States, building on the pioneering open access content created by the UK-based CORE Economics Education. Professor Sethi previously held visiting positions at Microsoft Research and the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton, New Jersey. He has served on the editorial board of the American Economic Review and Economics and Philosophy. And now it is my pleasure to give the floor to Rajiv Sethi.
Thank you so much, Claudia, for that introduction. And also, I just want to thank the Radcliffe Institute for pulling off something of a miracle. We're all meeting virtually, but there's a vibrant program, and I'm, really enjoying getting to know the other fellows who are just extraordinary people. And I'm so grateful to the Institute for having pulled this all together and giving me the opportunity to speak and to spend this year at the Institute. I'm going to start with a quote from Paul Butler of Georgetown Law School from his book, Chokehold. And he says, the information about itself that a society collects and does not collect is always revealing about the values of that society. We know, as we should, exactly how many police officers are killed in the line of duty, but we do not know, as we should, exactly how many civilians are killed by police. And he's referring here to official data. So there is an absence of reliable official data on police homicides, and in fact, police use of force more generally. And one person who agrees with this perspective is James Comey. When he was FBI director in 2015, he made a very similar comment, stating that the lack of official data on police shootings is ridiculous, embarrassing, and unacceptable. But that remains the case still today. But that doesn't mean there isn't data. So we have data from media organizations and other decentralized groups that have collected incident-based reports, really by collating media reports across the country. The Guardian and the Washington Post may be the best known traditional media sources, but you also have websites like Fatal Encounters and Mapping Police Violence. And the data that they've collected is incomplete by nature because they can't capture things that are not reported in the media. And also the level of detail varies from incident to incident, depending on how much media attention it receives. But they tell a consistent story, and they're quite reliable, considered to be quite reliable. One problem is that they don't go back very far, but I'll tell you what we can see in this data. I'll also tell you a bit about a new data assembly exercise where we try to merge this with agency-level information from other sources so that we can just figure out what's going on at a more fine-grained local level. So I have about half an hour, and I just want to go over the key points I'd like to make, hopefully, in that time, and they are as follows. Firstly, you have staggering geographic variation and regional clustering in exposure to deadly force. So the Mountain West and the Pacific also has extremely high exposure to deadly force relative to the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeastern states, the New England and Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, with the South and the Midwest somewhere in between. And there's large variation both in scale, the total exposure to deadly force, and in disparities by race and ethnicity. And the scale disparities and the disparities don't align very well. So areas where you have relatively low incidence, you have high disparities, and that's true of a lot of New England and the Mid-Atlantic states. And one consequence of this, which I don't think has received enough attention, is that this particular geographic variation and the way in which people are distributed across space is such that aggregation can disguise disparities. So what I mean by that is that you could have a set of locations, and I'll show you examples in a minute, where you have high levels of racial disparity at each location, but when you add them all together and look at the nation as a whole, or you look at this collection of areas, the disparities seem much smaller. And in fact, in an extreme case, they can vanish. They can be rendered invisible by the process of aggregation. This is something that statisticians are very familiar with, and they refer to as Simpson's paradox. But what I would like to argue is that this is relevant for deadly force in the United States. So looking at aggregate data, inferences made from national data, for example, are going to be misleading because they don't properly aggregate what's going on at the local level. And also inferences that are based on a small set of locations can be misleading because no location is typical. As I'll show you, Phoenix, Houston, and Los Angeles are completely different from New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. And if you look in detail at one of these locations, it tells you very little about the rest. And then another implication is that data-based claims about bias or disparate treatment, or the absence of bias or disparate treatment, need to really carefully consider the data generating process. And this hasn't always been done. So there are folks working with the statistical evidence, and there are folks who are looking at other forms of evidence, narrative evidence, video and audio evidence, police reports, grand jury testimony, and so on, historical evidence, psychological evidence from experiments. And these are really important to consider side by side with the statistical evidence. Otherwise, we can end up making mistaken inferences. That's one of the points I'd like to make. And a bottom line is what we find is that aside from usual determinants, what you might expect to be determinants of deadly force, like violent crime reports or dangers faced by officers themselves, or gun prevalence or gun ownership, there are other things that are idiosyncratic and agency-specific that matter. In particular, selection, training, leadership, and organizational culture, and the implications of this for police reform and looking at American policing in the future. I'll address right at the end. So let me just hopefully make these points in the time that I have. Some of what I'll say is contained in chapter 8 of my book with Dan that Claudia, you kindly mentioned. And some of the work I'll present is more recent and ongoing. So let's start with the Guardian database. This is for 2015 and 2016. And you see you have about 1,100 victims of police homicides a year. And on the right of this figure, you see the racial disparities, race-ethnic disparities in exposure. And in each of these years, Black and Native American exposure is very high, white and Asian exposure low, and Latinx exposure is intermediate between those two things. Now, if you look at this and you add these years up, take the average over the years, you see about 3 white fatalities annually per million population, about 7.5 Black fatalities annually per million population. which is a 2.5 to 1 disparity. So this is one way to think about a disparity in exposure to deadly force. You'll commonly see actually in media reports that there's a 2 to 1 or a 2.5 to 1 disparity. Is this a meaningful measure of disparities in exposure to deadly force? And the answer to this is no, it's not. It's a very misleading measure. And it's a misleading measure because, for reasons that I just discussed a minute ago, disparities can be diminished or disguised by aggregation. You can have greater disparities at each location than you have in the aggregate. And in the extreme cases, it can be rendered invisible. This is a fallacy of composition, and it has implications that I'll discuss a little bit later. So let me just illustrate this point just with a simple example, a couple of examples. So we'll start with two states, California and New York. They're both very large states, California larger than New York. And if you just look at the population that in the census for these 2 years, 2015, 2016, averaged, self-identifies as non-Hispanic Black and non-Hispanic White. So, you know, these populations for California and New York are listed on the slide. New York has a larger Black population, California has a larger white population, and California also has very large Latinx and Asian populations that are missing from this slide. I'll talk about a bit later. So you have states with different populations. Now, if you look at the victims, both California and New York victimizations are shown here. And in California, despite the fact that the Black population was smaller, you had a lot more Black victims of police violence, deadly violence. And that's also true for whites. So you have about 6 times as many whites killed in California as in New York State, even though the population of non-Hispanic whites in California is only 40% higher than that in New York. Okay, let's think about exposure. If you look at the, exposure measured at the, at the number of people who are victims of deadly violence relative to the population. So number of people killed per year per million people in the population. If you look down the columns, you see that no matter which group people belong to, they face much more risk of deadly violence in California than New York. So 15 in the case of African Americans in California relative to 4.4 in New York. For whites, it's 4.3 in California relative to 1 in New York. But the scale disparities between these two locations are so great that white Californians face approximately the same risks of being killed by police as Black New Yorkers. Of course, they face substantially higher risk than white New Yorkers. Now, if you look at the disparity, this is the way in which the 2.5 to 1 is computed in the Guardian data. So if you look at, white relative to Black, Black relative to white exposure rates, just divide one by the other, you get quite high disparities in both these cases, 3.5 in California and 4.5 in New York. But what happens if we just add New York and California together as if it's a country, right? And we fail to distinguish between where people are located in this country. Then you end up with a country, so to speak, of 30 million people, about 5 million Black, about 25 million white, and you see the victims there, just adding across the victims. Now you compute exposure for the country as a whole, you see exposure for Black exposure is 9, white is about 3, and the disparity computed for the country as a whole is actually less than at each location. So it's not an average in the sense that most people would interpret it. In fact, at each of these two locations, exposure is higher than you see in the nation as a whole, constructed in this way. Take very quickly one other example, which is even more extreme. So if you take, these are the largest counties in the country with regard to population served by the law enforcement agencies. So Maricopa County, Phoenix, which includes Phoenix, Los Angeles County, Harris County, Texas, which includes Houston, and New York City, which is a composite of 5 counties. You see similar patterns. So within groups, so if you look down the columns for exposure, Black exposure is highest in Phoenix and lowest in New York. And that's true for every other group. So Latinx exposure in Maricopa County is significantly higher than in New York City with the other 2 counties in between. Same with white exposure. You get these really big differences across space. And now if you look across the rows, you see that within each county, you've got very significant racial disparities and somewhat less significant ethnic disparities. And you see, so within each county, you're at much greater risk if you're Black than if you're Latinx, and if you're Latinx than if you're white. And then if you compute the disparities, exactly like we did before, you see the range of disparity for African Americans ranges from 2.8 to 8.4. For Latinx residents, it varies much less, from 1.1 to 1.7. What happens if you add these up and consider the country as a whole? This country composed of these 8 counties. Your measured disparity goes to 2.5, which is what you see in the Guardian data. it's actually less than the disparity at each component location. So one needs to interpret carefully what one sees when one looks at aggregate data. So let me very quickly now go through, those are just examples, but let me just quickly go through more systematically what we see in the country as a whole. And I'm going to use the fatal encounters data for the 6-year period, 2013 to 2018, and it particularly focus on the intentional use of deadly force. And we'll also see the regional clustering. The census just divides the country into 4 regions, West, Midwest, Northeast, and South, which are themselves divided into divisions. And I'll come back to the divisions later. First, let's look at the regions. So this is variation by state. And what you see here is the exposure, again, measured as before, the number of fatalities per year per million population overall, right, disregarding race and ethnicity. And you see there's huge variation. So, you've got, Rhode Island, New York up there near the top with the lowest levels of exposure. New Mexico right there is off on its own at the bottom. One of the fellows, Will Mackin, I believe is in New Mexico. He may have something to say about this. And, he was an extra, I think, on Breaking Bad. And he can maybe give us some insight into this. But you see also the regional clustering. So the Western states and the Southern states to a lesser extent have relatively high exposure, Midwestern states and the Northeastern states much lower. And so you see the clustering by color. So the green states are Northeastern, Midwestern states are in yellow, Southern states in white, and the Western states in red. So now let's look at how disparities are varying across space. And so here you see white exposure and black exposure on the vertical and horizontal axes, respectively. The steep line over here is the line of parity. So that tells you, along that line, you'll see states, there aren't any, but you'll see states where black and white exposure would be equal. The 2-to-1 disparity is the middle line, and the 4-to-1 disparity is the shallower, flatter line. And here you see also clustering in disparities by region. So the Northeast, which has low levels of overall use of lethal force, has very high disparities. And there's something that puzzled us when we first saw it, and maybe people can submit comments and questions about this, but it's interesting that if you look between the line of parity and the 2-to-1, the states that have relatively low levels of disparity in the country, they're all in the South, some of them in the Deep South, and some of them were part of the Confederacy. And this was definitely not the case in the 1930s. We have some data from the 1930s, and the racial disparity in the South was extreme. It's extremely high, but that's not showing up in the data for the contemporary period. We have some ideas about why that might be the case, but it'd be interesting to hear some feedback on that. That's a puzzle. So just to recap, when you see things like this is from the Washington Post about, that says, okay, there's a 2-to-1 disparity. There's a temptation to interpret it as somehow in average disparity. It could be a very severe underestimate of the disparities in most states. In fact, you see in this diagram that most states have more than 2-to-1 disparity, almost all of them, and many of them have more than a 4-to-1 disparity. Okay, so let me talk now for a few minutes about inferences that people make from this data. And sometimes, people have tried to use this statistical evidence to try to make inferences about whether or not there is bias or disparate treatment. So once a police-civilian interaction has been initiated, a key question actually from a moral, philosophical, and empirical point of view is, are there racial differences in the likelihood to which somebody's going to end up, being victimized, especially being victimized, being a victim of lethal force? I'll give you 2 examples, and I don't particularly want to pick on these, but these are both Harvard economists. So I just want to give you an example of how the statistical evidence has been used in certain ways that I think can be questioned. So I'll start with a case in the New York Times by Sendil Mullainathan. This is the title of the article, and here's the argument he makes. So he says, for the entire country, about 29% of arrestees are African-American. This number is not very different from the 32% of police shooting victims who are African-American. If police discrimination were a big factor in actual killings, we would have expected a larger gap between the arrest rate and the police killing rate. And this in turn suggests that removing police racial bias will have little effect on the killing rate. Now, this is an op-ed. This is not a peer-reviewed article, but it expresses a certain view that we call the contact hypothesis in a very clear way. And I just want to challenge the reasoning. He may be right or he may be wrong, but I just want to challenge the reasoning a bit. So there are 2 problems with this. One is a statistical problem. The fallacy of composition that I've described already means that comparisons made on aggregates are not very informative. They can be misleading. And really what you want to do if you want to conduct this kind of exercise is to look location by location, compare arrest rates and victimization rates by location. And if you do that, you will not get this conclusion. I'll show you some evidence for that later. But there's also a deeper, more conceptual problem with this reasoning. And basically, and this is why it's important to consider other forms of evidence, narrative evidence, historical evidence, and psychological evidence. And the deeper problem is that the processes that give rise to arrest are themselves race contingent. Implicit in the argument, this kind of reasoning, is that what you have to do to get yourself arrested if you're Black is pretty much the same as what you have to do to get yourself arrested if you're white. If this assumption does not hold, and we have evidence that it does not hold, then the pool of arrestees is not going to be the same. They're not going to be comparable pools. In particular, if a whole bunch of folks are getting arrested for doing things that they would not get arrested for if they were white, then the pool of Black arrestees is getting inflated, but it's getting inflated in a way that makes it objectively less threatening to officers. You're adding to this pool, and you can think of examples like Henry Louis Gates on his front porch, Sandra Bland's arrest in Prairie View, Texas, which never should have taken place. And then the Philadelphia Starbucks arrestees, Rashawn Nelson and Dante Robinson. Again, these are cases. You can think of others where the Black arrest pool is inflated by the addition of people who are not objectively threatening to officers. And under these conditions, the parity of arrest and victimization rates can be consistent with disparate treatment or bias. It isn't evidence of the absence of disparate treatment or bias. And Dan and I made this point in the book as follows. Well, I think I'll skip this slide. You can take a look if you like, but it basically repeats what I've just said, so I'll skip the slide. There's a very interesting, I just want to briefly mention the kinds of evidence that are important to consider. There's a very interesting exchange between an officer, Leon Lashley. There's a famous picture of the Gates arrest that you can see on the bottom of the slide here. The officer in the foreground is Leon Lashley, and he had an interview with Anderson Cooper on CNN. Unfortunately, the video is no longer available, but the transcript is up online. And he basically stands by James Crowley, the arresting officer. He says, he didn't have any qualms with the arrest. But he also says, that would it have been different if I had shown up first? I think it probably would have been different. And Anderson Cooper says, because? And he doesn't really explain, but he says, Black man to Black man, it probably would have been different. And the implicit assumption here also, I think, is that white man to white man, it would have been different. Had Crowley showed up to this kind of situation and Gates had been white, it would have turned out different. And because of interactions like this, because of the way in which they are, they play out, they evolve in ways that are race contingent. You can't take these arrest pools and treat them in the way that I think was done in the Mulanathan article. Now, something similar, but much more involved, is a paper by Roland Fryer, another Harvard economist. This was also featured in the New York Times. And he also he looked in detail at Houston data, rather than just comparing arrests. So again, the goal was to compare arrests to shootings, but he also had contextual factors, so more details regarding each particular incident. And this required a lot of work. So he constructed, with a lot of help from research assistants, an arrest pool, a group of people who were arrested for certain charges that he thought were indicative of a high likelihood of justified use of lethal force relative to other forms of arrest. And then he compared this with a pool of officer-involved shooting, and this was done with a random draw of arrests for a 15-year period from Houston. So what did he find? He found that in the raw data, that the Black share in the arrest data was 58%. In the shooting data, officer-involved shooting data was 52%. So if you carry out the Mulanathan exercise, compare arrests to lethal force, again, you'll see in the raw data, there's no evidence for disparate treatment. But he also finds that the arrest pools differ substantially. In fact, if you look deeper into the data, you see that 2/3 of the arrested whites were said to have attacked or drawn weapon, as opposed to 1/2 of Blacks. And in fact, 95% of the people in the arrest pool were unarmed. So this was attacked without a weapon. But you see that they're qualitatively different. Now I'm going to skip through the details of this in the interest of time. But because these pools are qualitatively different, again, it's not an apples to apples comparison. And paper that just appeared this month in the Journal of Political Economy, that's a comment on this Fryer paper by Derloff and Heckman, makes this point. So they say, suppose that biased police randomly stop Blacks and stop whites only when there's some reason unobserved by the analyst that events after a stop will lead to a justified discharge of a weapon. if blacks are equally likely to be shot in that case, that would reflect bias in the discharge of weapon decision because of differences in group characteristics. It cannot be interpreted as evidence of the absence of bias. And there's a paper in the American Political Science Review just a couple of months ago by Knox, Lowe, and Momolo that makes a very similar point as well. So one needs to, so the broader point here is that statistical evidence can't be analyzed in isolation. It has to be analyzed with some attention to the data generating process if one is going to draw valid conclusions. Now that's the contact hypothesis. Let me quickly talk about how most people, I think, look at police violence and race in America. And this goes back to this, the conditions under which police are actually allowed to use force, which is fear. So, at least under a federal standard since 1985, force is not permitted to be used unless an officer has probable cause to believe that a suspect poses a significant threat of death or serious physical injury to the officer or others. So if fear is the only justified reason to use lethal force, and if stereotypes affect threat perception, which is something that psychologists have been telling us for a while, that could give rise to racial disparities in exposure to deadly force. Now, you can't test this statistically in quite the same way as you test discrimination in labor markets. For example, there's this famous resume study by Bertrand and Mullenathan that sent out resumes that changed the name, only the name. And they looked at callback rates. So they compared, names that were switched to black sounding as opposed to white sounding, names which had high relative frequency in the black community as opposed to the white. And they measured rates of return, rates of callback, and found evidence of discrimination and bias. You can't really do that kind of thing. You can't put people at risk to test this directly statistically. So you have to rely on, to some extent at least, on philosophical, historical, and narrative evidence. And there's plenty of this. So I think the clearest example of sort of race contingent levels of fear is in the fortunately non-fatal shooting of LeVar Jones in South Carolina in 2014. And this video is online. If you take a look, it's very, very striking. And LeVar Jones, actually, he's serving a 5-year sentence for assault and battery. And he was dismissed immediately from the police force. And the director, South Carolina Department of Public Safety Director, Leroy Smith, stated that the reason for dismissal was that he reacted to a perceived threat when there was none. It was broad daylight, clear and unobstructed view, and this should not have been perceived as a threat. There was no action by LeVar Jones that should have been perceived as threatening. Now, he doesn't mention that the race of the victim in this case could have played a role in the level of threat perception, but others have interpreted it. If you look at the video, you reach your own conclusions, but many have concluded that to be the case. Very similar to the case of Philando Castile in Falcon Heights, Minnesota. He was driving, his girlfriend Diamond Reynolds was in the passenger seat, her 4-year-old daughter in the back. And under those circumstances, and he had a license, he was licensed to carry a firearm, and he declared very calmly to the officer that he had a firearm. And those are not the conditions under which you normally expect there to be a high level of threat. But in the testimony that he gave to officers on the day after the shooting, this is Geronimo Yanez, the officer in this case, he describes being extremely fearful. Now, in the charging decision, so John Choi, the county attorney who made the decision to charge Yanez in this case, he makes clear that, fear justifies the use of deadly force, but not if it's irrational fear. Subjective fear is not enough. It can't be unreasonable. And in this case, it was unreasonable. Again, he doesn't say it was unreasonable because Philando Castile was black, that it would not have occurred if he was white, but others have said so, including Mark Dayton, the governor of Minnesota at the time, and Peter Moskos, he's a faculty member at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice and served for a couple of years in the Baltimore City Police Department, and not anti-cop in any sense, but he says that I don't think there's a chance in hell that Castile would have been shot had he been white. So this is the kind of evidence that most people, I think, have in mind when they think about racial disparities in exposure to deadly force. And the point I'm trying to make is that this has to be balanced or placed side by side with the statistical evidence in trying to understand disparate treatment. There's a lot of historical evidence also that I won't have time to go through, but I'll just mention two things and I'll refer you to the book for more details. So we started with this quote from Paul Butler and James Comey. And it's true. In recent years, we've got very, very little data on deadly use of force by law enforcement officers in the United States. But there are a couple of periods in history where we have quite a lot of data. So there was an extraordinary data collection exercise in the 1930s that led eventually to the culmination of the two-volume work by Gunnar Myrdal, American Dilemma in 1944. And it was funded by the Carnegie Corporation. And there was a large number of people, including Ralph Bunche and other scholars who were involved in this effort. And Arthur Raper, a sociologist, collected data from 228 agencies. And these agencies in those days were not at all reticent in disclosing information about whom they had killed and under what conditions. But you see lots and lots of reports of fear and preemption, both by officers and off officers, and very high rates of killing, high racial disparities, and in fact, very high rates of killing off officers as well. And then the other period historically is the Kerner Commission report. And this is really extraordinary level of police killings of civilians, by far the largest in recent history. In Newark and Detroit alone, you had 50 people killed in just a week. And many of them women, children, and elderly. There's a very moving report in the Kerner Commission document of 3 mothers, one of them a grandmother, who were killed within seconds of each other because of mass firing towards an apartment building. Much, much larger than you see anytime today. And the Kerner Commission has lots of, evidence of what they call exaggerated fear based on erroneous reports of sniper fire. People were thought that they were under attack, and a lot of inexperienced young National Guardsmen ended up, fulfilling this expectation of violence and climate of fear by shooting at the slightest provocation, often at something that was started by somebody else in their group. Just as an aside, I was very fearful a few months ago when Lafayette Square was cleared that we were facing something like this when there were low-flying helicopters. There were National Guard in a large number of American cities. I don't think the fear has entirely been dispelled, but at least we didn't get to a repetition of this, at least not yet. But this is something just to keep in mind as a historical episode that has lessons for the present day. I think I have less than 5 minutes left. So let me just wrap up with what I hope to do at the Radcliffe Institute and a project that I'm involved in with some colleagues and students at Barnard and Columbia. I mentioned Pepe Montilolia in particular is a statistician, econometrician, Dan O'Flaherty, and several of our students. And I'll also want to mention Olivia Hartzell, who just started the graduate program in economics at Harvard. So let me just briefly describe what we are doing. So as I mentioned earlier, you really need to focus on the agency level. This is where organizational culture lies. This is where selection and training protocols have effect. This is where leadership can make a difference. But policing in America is extremely decentralized. You've got over 18,000 local police departments, another 3,000 sheriff's offices. Los Angeles County alone has over 150 agencies, and 89 of them are police departments or sheriff's office, one sheriff's office and 88 police departments. And 28 of these agencies had at least one police homicide over the 6-year period. So, we need to tie the data on incidents to agency level characteristics, which is what we have been doing. And I'll just show you, just a little bit of what descriptive information about what we found, and then I'll stop for the Q&A. So if you look at, so these are the largest agencies. So this is now agency level data. These are the largest agencies by population served. And if you look at the homicide rates, again, this is exposure rates as measured previously in the previous slides that I showed you. You see massive differences, huge differences with Phoenix at the top. Las Vegas and LA, depending on how you measure, also having extremely high rates of high incidence of deadly force. So if you measure as per capita, how many people are killed relative to the population, you'll see Phoenix, Las Vegas, Los Angeles right there at the top. Per officer, Phoenix, Las Vegas, San Antonio. Per crime, Phoenix, Los Angeles, and San Diego. If you look at the country, the agencies with the lowest levels, you'll see actually mostly in the East, Chicago, Philadelphia, and New York, at least among the set of very large agencies. That's the pattern you see, which we saw actually before. Just to wrap up, if you then plot this, no matter how you normalize the incidence of deadly force, you see these large differences from Phoenix on the left, going down to New York on the right, with the others in between. And finally, by census division. So there are 9 census divisions. if you just look at the same exposure statistics for that, you get this extraordinarily striking graph, I think, with the steady decline as you move, from the western states in the Mountain and Pacific to the southern states, West, South, Central, East, and South Atlantic, to the Midwestern in the West, North Central and East, North Central, to the eastern states of the Middle Atlantic and New England. It varies. It depends a little bit on how you measure these things, but the pattern is very, very clear. So this is my last slide. I just want to take a minute to just talk about where we are today in American history, because I think it's a very crucial, very critical moment. The protests following the killing of George Floyd were among the largest in generations. You had, on one day in June, you had about 500,000 people at 550 cities. Mississippi flag was replaced in June, or at least the decision was made. Bipartisan vote to remove Confederate statues from the Capitol. The NYPD dropped the plainclothes anti-crime units, which had the highest levels of complaints of abuse against them, but also had the highest rates of gun recoveries. You had significant rise in homicides in several cities, and that's been widely reported. New York City, year over year, is up 40% in the total number of murders and manslaughters. And there's been some pushback against the defunding and dismantling rhetoric. So a lot of debate is going on about American policing. It's really important to get this right. But you have had, one Brooklyn City Council member described the defunding and dismantling rhetoric, I think, as political gentrification. It's an interesting expression, but there's a debate going on right now, and there's a lot of lack of clarity on what even these terms mean. But the large geographic variation suggests a lot of scope for reduction in police homicides, we think, by focusing on things like selection, training, leadership, and organization culture. What I think most people want is to curtail abuse, establish trust, increase witness cooperation, and increase clearance rates for severe crimes, extreme crimes like homicide, like murder and manslaughter. And this is one of the dimensions of inequality that is really underreported and under-scrutinized. Inequality in the likelihood that somebody will be brought to justice if you are killed. So the inequality in the rates at which murders will be solved is very, very extreme, with huge racial disparities in the United States. And finally, the Camden case model. I have no time to talk about it. It was an interesting case. It doesn't fit any particular narrative. And whether it's a good model and whether it's replicable, I think would be a good topic for a Radcliffe Exploratory Seminar. I'm sorry I took a couple of minutes, I think, over my time, but I'm going to hand back to Claudia. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Rajiv. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. We have a lot of questions. So let me start with immediately with the first one. Outside of gender and behavior at point of arrest, what is the biggest predictor of exposure to police violence? Race, county, or department jurisdiction, or age?
That's a great question. We know that race is a major predictor, but I did not realize before starting this project a few years ago that geographic location would be just as big. The location across agencies within group is of the same magnitude as within agencies across group. So race and geography have comparable magnitude in terms of risks. Age is very interesting. I think it's worth looking at, and we want to look at. In general, you have. Exposure is greatest for people in the mid to late 20s, but I have a feeling, I haven't looked at this, but I think it's worth looking at. I think that the exposure to deadly force by age is race contingent. So if you think about Tamir Rice, for instance, who was 12 years old, I have never heard, or cannot imagine, but maybe I'm wrong, anybody, even approximately 12 years old, who's white, who's been killed by police. And so I think that the age distribution is uneven across groups. I think there's a broader age distribution, greater variance and greater support in the distribution by age for black civilians as opposed to white civilians when facing deadly force. But that's not something I've looked at. That's a speculation at this point.
Sure. What is the reason for limiting the intent to intentional killings and excluding unintentional or bystander police involvement deaths? One can imagine that these may show racial, ethnic variation, more reckless pursuit, more fear of apprehension, leading more risky flight when suspect is a person of color, and so on.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That reinforces the point that it's really important to consider narrative evidence and historical evidence. Now, some of these databases, so the Fatal Encounters database has a flag for intentional use of deadly force. the others just screen that out at the stage of data assembly. So just to make data comparable across sources, one needs to at least start there. But you're right. But there are many incidents that are in the data that are not classified as intentional use of deadly force, which involve suicides, for instance, or vehicle chases, where somebody will crash into another vehicle. And you're right; those are worth scrutinizing too. We have not done that, but and I had not considered it until I saw this question. But I think it's certainly worth considering. The intentional use of deadly force itself has other problems. So, for example, in the fatal encounters, intentional use of deadly force, it includes off-duty killings. So including domestic violence. So it includes killing of an officer of a spouse. That's treated as intentional use of deadly force, even though you may want to separate that or screen that out. There's no easy way to do that because it's hard from the narratives to screen out a situation where a police officer is called for a domestic disturbance and there's an incidence of deadly force versus one where that officer at home off duty kills their spouse, and those are conflated. So those are two problems. There's an over-inclusion in the intentional use of deadly force in fatal encounters data, but there's also an under-inclusion, as the questioner is pointing at, and we should look at that, and that's a very good suggestion. Yeah.
Thank you. Moving on. So do you know similar analyses have been applied to the geography of hate crimes, racially motivated or otherwise, with civilian offenders, in what I also assume to be an absence of official data about the hate crimes in the US, especially disaggregated?
Yeah, I don't know of studies of that. Crime data, so one of the things that we tried to do in this work, and are still trying to do, is to try to look at crime data in relation to incidents of police use of force. But the crime data in the United States is really, really unreliable, unfortunately. And that's also true for hate crime data. And part of the reason is exactly this decentralized nature of American policing. So you have so many departments and they have their own reporting requirements and protocols. And so you get reporting. I mean, even if you look at some of the most serious crimes, so let me give you an example. If you look at, one of the things we tried to look at is gun robberies and gun assaults. And for these, you've got some large agencies, including Chicago, that will not break down their data in this way, whereas other agencies do. And so it became impossible for us to even use that particular crime. I suspect that the same unreliability exists with hate crimes. Now, one should make the effort, and there may be ways to do this in a compelling way. But I don't know of studies that have done it. But if the questioner is suggesting that the hate crime data may have something to tell us about, lethal force, that's certainly a possibility. So we may try to include hate crime data in some of our covariates. I will look into that. It's relevant. Yeah.
That's great. Another interesting question. So how do regional differences and west to east gradient relate to gun ownership statistics?
Yeah. Yeah, this is so. I should mention David Hemingway, right? He's a fellow this year. Is an expert on policing, lethal force, gun prevalence, and gun ownership. And so I assume he'll be talking about this at some of the presentations. So what we did. So here's what we have done: is to take so measures of gun prevalence. So one way to think about this is. So gun ownership is one variable. We have data on gun ownership. The problem with that is that, gun ownership may not necessarily translate into gun violence or gun crimes in a very obvious way. And there's, you really want data on gun use or gun crimes or gun incidents. And for that, we have data on things like, homicides that are related to, gun deaths includes homicides and suicides. Suicide is, in fact, the largest component of deaths by gunshot. And one can use gun deaths, including suicides, as a measure of how prevalent guns are in a particular area. Now, when we do that, I should say this is very preliminary. In fact, we've just been, looking at these results over the last few days, but I hope to look at this more deeply during the year at the Radcliffe Institute. But when we look at that, we find that we really can't explain a whole lot of the geographic variation. So even taking into account the gun prevalence, gun ownership, and gun deaths do have the predicted effect on the incidence of lethal force, right? More gun ownership, more prevalence, is positively correlated with the incidence of lethal force. But there's a huge amount left unexplained, even when we take those into account at the agency level. But of course, gun ownership is very coarsely measured at the agency level because you have to look at the state or the county at best. You don't have agency level gun ownership or gun prevalence. And like I said, agency level gun crimes are not very useful for this exercise. But we're trying to look at that. That's obviously, and David has already pointed out to me that that's an important factor to consider. But it's for the future. I don't have much to say about it right now. Thank you, though.
Okay. Is there any correlation, positive or negative, between population-wide exposure to lethal force and racial disparity in such exposures? In other words, are places with high lethal force used overall likely to have more disparity as well as or less?
Yeah, this is a point I think I touched on during the presentation, but I would love to expand on a little bit. The answer is no, actually. No, it's not. And this is what gives rise to the Simpson's paradox type effect. The disparities are really high at locations where the scale is relatively low. And that's why when you aggregate, you get a mess. You get this situation where you get disparity measures that are not terribly meaningful. It's arising precisely because the scale and the disparities are not tightly connected and positively correlated. So I showed one figure, and if it's possible, I would like to post these slides so people can actually look at that figure. And you see, many of the New England states have very low levels of overall scale, but very high disparities. And then you've got this cluster of southern states, which have relatively low disparities, but moderate levels of scale, and so on. And then you've got states like Oklahoma, which is just out on its own. It's got extremely high disparities, but also extremely high scale. So, there's a mixture of these things. And that's partly why when you look at the national data, you get something that ought not to be overinterpreted. You get something that people can be misled by.
Another question. Is the data on police homicide rates by agency publicly available? And did you discover any impact on police use of deadly force in those states with open carry or concealed carry laws?
So is the data publicly available? Not yet, but it will be within weeks. So we have assembled it and we've started to analyze it, but we just wanted to get some results and that we're confident with and post a working paper at least before we make it public. But we're going to make this public. We have a data set at the agency level that is merging the incidence of police force. It was a difficult data set to construct, I have to tell you, because in fatal encounters, the agency responsible is identified, but the name that is used, even names differences, like, in one data set, you have got City of New York Police Department, in another, you'll have New York City Police Department. You cannot automatically merge these things very easily, but we did it. We've got a very, very comprehensive data set where almost every incident has been matched to an agency, and every agency has a total number of homicides over a 6-year period. This will be posted very soon. The data itself, we are confident, is accurate, but we'd like to just actually use it a bit and see what it says and post a working paper before we make the data public, but absolutely it will be public. I've lost the second part of that question. Was it about gun open carry laws? Very briefly, we haven't looked at that. We're trying to look at whether states are Ghana states, whether they adopt the federal Ghana standards for their local use of police force protocols for their agencies. I don't have results for that yet. That's something we're doing, right away. Part of what I tried to present was work that I planned to do at Radcliffe. And so a lot of these questions are dealing with things that, within a few months I'll have answers to. Wonderful.
Do you think your findings, research, will help amplify calls for abolishment of the police?
This is, as I was saying on the last slide, this is a really extraordinary time, actually, in American history. I think, we look back on it as a pivotal moment. And for the first time, actually, abolition, sometimes conflated with dismantling or defunding, is actually part of the policy menu. It's under discussion. At the same time, if you think about, let's say, the Minneapolis City Council, it's just interesting to watch the evolution of this. You had a veto-proof majority that signed on to essentially what appeared to be abolition, and many of them have backed away from it now. And you've got Ras Baraka, let's say, for example, the mayor of New York, talking about dismantling and defunding as as a bourgeois liberal solution to a complex problem. This is the kind of discourse right now. There's a lot of misunderstanding. The folks who are abolition advocates believe that their case is misunderstood. This is my sense that I'm getting. But there are others who are very resistant to it, and they feel that they need to protect their constituents, and this is not a constructive way to proceed. But certainly abolition is, for the first time I've seen, I mean, of course, people have advocated it before in the past, but mostly in academic circles. But it's actually, up for discussion right now. Is it the right approach or not? I'm not sure. I think the Camden example, which I didn't have a chance to talk about, is a very interesting example, actually, but it doesn't tell a very clean story. In a sense, that police force was dismantled in 2012. It was dismantled. The homicide rates were extremely high. It was essentially ineffective. There was a budget crisis. It was replaced by a county-level police force in 2013. There were a lot of complaints against that county-level police force in 2014, leading up to 2014, and it was then, reformed and modified. Those complaints went down quite substantially. This is my reading of the evidence. And clearance rates, homicide clearance rates went up, witness cooperation went up, police-community relations went up. Not ideal by any means, but relative to what it was before. Is Camden a case of sort of dismantling? It's certainly, dismantling at one level and then reconstituting. And if you do that, you can change things like selection, training, organizational culture, and leadership at a stroke. You can do that. But it's not abolition by any means, right? The police force at the end was actually larger than the one initially. And so I think it's really important to consider every single type of policy, abolition included, with a clear-headed view of what it entails. That's, and it's astonishing actually that this is actually up for discussion right now compared to before. But this is where maybe the Radcliffe Institute can actually constitute an exploratory seminar to try to explore exactly what these things mean and have a conversation across, from people, including practitioners and academics, that actually lay out these issues in some depth and detail.
Right, thank you. Just for the audience, this is probably likely to be the last question. What about the racial composition of the police? I would compare, for example, police violence in Memphis and Detroit in the early 70s to today. Quite different. Yeah. Going from predominantly white to predominantly black police.
Yeah. This is interesting. I didn't have time to talk about, since you mentioned Detroit, let me just go back to the Kerner Commission report. It's fascinating. It was extremely high levels of violence. 50 people killed in Newark and Detroit in a week. It's extraordinary. It's much, much higher than we've seen, I think, at any other time, at least in the last century. And yet, you had one part of Detroit. It's fascinating. You had one part of Detroit that was patrolled by soldiers, actually. They were headed by somebody called General Throckmorton. And that was an integrated police force, actually. They had seen service in Vietnam. And he had his officers basically, take the bullets out of their guns. They try to communicate. And, this is a situation where there's an enormous amount of tension. This is, the summer of 1967 in Newark and Detroit. And they managed to have, extremely different outcomes with regard to the total number of firearms discharged, the total number of bullets, the total number of fatalities. There was one civilian fatality there, so it was not zero. But compared to where there was sort of this random firing in Newark and other parts of Detroit, it was a huge difference. With regard to officers, so Fryer's paper that I mentioned before, and his response, and it's worth reading. He's got a response in the Journal of Political Economy. I don't want to be too critical of what he did, because he would argue that he's taking account such factors. contextual factors such as the likelihood of a suspect being armed or attacking and using or drawing a weapon, according to, at least to the police reports. But he does look at officer race in his, and does not find an impact of that. But I think again, generalization from one location or a small set of locations is not easy. But I think that the historical evidence from Newark suggests that this could be a factor. I don't know whether predominantly black police forces versus white is the only comparison that one would want to make. Integrated police forces with people integrated at all levels of seniority versus those that are largely segregated, maybe a point of cleavage as well.
We can squeeze in one last brief question. So have you looked at zip code level data for municipality and counties? If so, what does it reveal?
So no, we have not looked at zip code level data, because if you think about, let's say, the New York Police Department, there are literally hundreds of zip codes, and they are you can look at zip code level data in the following sense. So the incident level reports in fatal encounters they have coordinates, they have latitude and longitude, and there you have a zip code for where the incident occurred. But we haven't exploited that. It might be worth doing. I have to think about that a little bit. We focused really on the agencies because, from a policy point of view, if you're talking about reform, or even if you're talking about defunding, dismantling, it's the agency level action that you're contemplating. And so we took the agency as a unit of analysis, and the agency doesn't fit very well with zip code in that sense. So some of the larger agencies will have hundreds of zip codes. The smaller ones may have just a single one, or you may have many agencies within a single zip code as well. And of course, agencies traverse zip codes. They'll move across zip codes, even if the agency itself is located in a particular zip code. So my focus so far has been at the agency level as a unit of analysis. Whether it's worth also doing some work at the level of zip code, which is possible with the data, I believe, one would have to construct a sort of a different merged data set, which may be worth doing. It's not something we've done. It's not even something we've contemplated at this point, but I'll give it some thought.
Great, thank you. Well, this is all we have time for today. Thank you, Rajiv, for the thoughtful presentation and your perspectives. I also want to thank you, the audience, for the terrific questions. I hope you'll be able to join us for other Radcliffe virtual programs. You can find out about future programs and watch videos of past events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you again for joining today, and have a good rest of the day.